Hello, everybody. Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be at the moment. Welcome to United States history. Today is actually going to be my final lesson for you guys for the year, so hopefully it's a good one. And we're going to end with the political response to the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement is something that happened over, almost 18 years of full-time activism and that sort of thing. We're only going through a small piece of what the entire movement really had to offer because there's so many different voices, so many different organizations. It kind of falls under this umbrella, but there's a lot of things going on in American history at this time, especially once we get to the mid to late 60s. And just all the different kind of movements happening that were out to change American life in general. Of course, we have things like the anti-war movement, the hippie movement. We had earlier things like the Beat Generation, and we had all sorts of different social movements going on during this time. But the civil rights movement really stands unique in those, in terms of how much it was able to get done, in not just in terms of social change, but legislative change as well. And today we're going to be talking about the government's response to civil rights and the civil rights movement. So remember, what year are we at? We're at 1960 with this guy down here, John F. Kennedy. He becomes president, is elected in the year 1960. And during the first bit of his presidency, he's more focused on the Cold War and about containing communism. However, he ends up changing his tune a little bit to becoming more in favor of domestic issues, especially the issues of civil rights. Kennedy really wasn't president for that long, but he had a very outsized, contribution to United States policy moving forward. He was elected in 1960, became president in 1961, and he was assassinated in November of 1963. So despite only being president for about, 2.5 years, a little bit more than that, he has a very long-lasting legacy. And this is kind of where he decided to change his tune on the civil rights movement in general, after not being super interested about it in his political career so far. He saw that a lot of the inequality that was happening in America, especially when it came to voting rights, if we were going to go out in the Cold War and trying to be, the bastion of freedom across the world while still mistreating our citizens and not giving them rights in the way that we were, then, we were being hypocritical. So he said, if the president does not himself wage the struggle for equal rights, if he stands above the battle, then the battle will inevitably be lost. He believed that it was up to the leader of the United States to set a good example, especially when it came to the ideas of civil rights and that people would be given fair and equal treatment. The Birmingham incident, which we talked about last time, really changed his mind. Once he saw, once again, television being a huge deal, once he saw kind of the police brutality and the outsized kind of response to the civil rights movement in the South, he really decided to be in favor of it. This is some stuff that we'll go over more if we were sitting down in class. One of Kennedy's speeches about kind of his change of heart. He moved to ban discrimination wherever federal funding was involved. However, Congress kind of ignored this bill that he tried to get passed. It's going to take more than that to actually get people on the side of passing a general civil rights bill, and that's what we're going to talk about. A lot of the ideas behind what made the Civil Rights Bill actually get passed in 1964 was this: the March on Washington in August of 1963. More than 200,000 people marched in favor of it. And this is also the scene of the famous Martin Luther King Jr. speech of "I Have a Dream." This is just where we have lots of famous people ended up joining. We have like Jackie Robinson, we have Bob Dylan, Sammy Davis Jr. there. A lot of famous people are also becoming involved in the movement for civil rights. And of course, we have the famous March on Washington and the speech there, the "I Have a Dream" speech. And let me read just a bit of that. This is on page 950 of your books if you want to read along. And yeah, let's just read the text and really see what Dr. King was talking about here. He says, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. When we allow freedom to reign, when we let it reign from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of that old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And of course, one of the key parts of that speech there, the one that you hear time and time again, it's I have a dream that one day we'll live in a nation where they will not be judged on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. Not about what you look like, but what you decide to be, what you decide that your personality is going to be like, where you're judged on your actions and not judged on just your skin type or who your family was really the key part of that message. Of course, this is the fame. We can see just the hundreds of thousands of people joining up around the National Mall here in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and of course that speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. How did it actually get passed? It wasn't right after the March on Washington. It actually happened 3 months after President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, in November of 1963. President Lyndon Johnson became president. He was the vice president before, and he was known for his really aggressive dealing in the Senate. He was very good at kind of compromise in getting the bills that he wanted passed. And his big his big thing that he wanted to get passed this time was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He really wanted to get this passed no matter what. However, there were many senators, especially people in his own party, the Democratic Party, in the South that opposed this bill. Now we have to remember that going way back to the time of the Civil War, that the Democratic Party was very much entrenched in the South, and they kind of went along with, they kind of had like a coalition with people in the North, like Roosevelt and the New Deal and all that. They went along with that, and then at this point now, this is where things are going to change, and the South is going to become reliably Republican as opposed to Democrat. But this is all that really happens after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So Johnson is trying to best to his, he's wheeling and dealing. He's trying to make all these deals with senators to make it so they pass the bill. But a lot of them just say, no, we're not going to have this. We're not going to outlaw segregation. And many of them even start a filibuster. This is where senators prevent a vote by taking the floor and refusing to stop talking. Technically, you're allowed to talk as long as you want. When a bill is being debated, the senators are allowed to talk as long as they want to. So sometimes they end up talking for hours and hours and hours. And so I think the record is something like 22 hours of talking straight, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. Johnson got a Republican friend to use something called cloture. What is that? Well, that's a procedure that may be used to limit or end debate and call for a vote. So basically you need 3/5 of the people voting to agree to stop to stop the filibuster, and that's exactly what happened. 3/5 of the senators said, we'll stop this filibuster right now and let's vote right away. And they did, and the bill ended up passing. These bills were easy to pass in the House of Representatives, which is, of course, based on population. So this is a very popular measure, but in the Senate, it was much harder because, remember, every state gets 2 votes. So it's very hard to get it passed in the Senate. Reminder is, like I was saying before, Johnson and most southern states have been Democrats for generations, and this vote caused many to switch party affiliation and go to the Republican side. And to this day, the South is very, very reliably Republican. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had a few main statutes. Let's go through the 4 main ones, which are a little bit out of order, but don't worry about it. Number 1 would be Title I. It banned the use of different voter registration standards for blacks and whites. Title II prohibited discrimination in public accommodations such as motels, restaurants, gas stations, theaters, and sport arenas. Title VI allowed the withholding of federal funds from public or private programs that practice discrimination. And then finally, Title VII banned discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin by employers and unions, and also created what's known as the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to investigate charges of job discrimination. So the Civil Rights Act had a lot of profound impacts, basically making sure that segregation would never ever be legal again. The fact it actually passed in the Senate and in the House meant that it would apply to the entirety of the United States, and it banned discrimination everywhere. Fighting for the vote, however, despite having the Civil Rights Act passed, it did not mean everything just went back to everything being sunshine and rainbows, hunky-dory. No, in fact, many people were outraged about the passage of it, and it led to an event called the Freedom Summer. There was 3 civil rights leaders were actually murdered, believe it or not. There were 80 mob attacks, over 1,000 people were arrested, and African-American churches were burned or firebombed. So there was a lot of violent outburst from people in a lot of southern states against the Civil Rights Act and against this bill that had been passed. So even though it had passed and that many legal rights were secured for Black Americans, many people in the South were not happy about this. This leads us to the Selma March, which is documented in that movie that came out not too long ago entitled Selma. So there were still voting rights problems. Local officials wouldn't let Black people register to vote. There were all sorts of loopholes where people figured out, well, if you don't let them get registered to vote, then they can't vote. So the Civil Rights Movement did not end with the Civil Rights Act being passed. There was a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and at first a lot of these marchers were attacked by state troopers. However, they took a second march the next day, and they were protected by the National Guard and by President Johnson, using stern words to say, do not attack the marchers, the peaceful protesters. And this led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this is the last major piece of legislation that will be passed during this time period. It got around another filibuster, because there's another one after this, and they got around it by using the same tactics that they had before. The main part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was to protect voters' rights. It outlawed things like literacy tests and other barriers for Black Americans to vote. And as a result, 400,000 African Americans registered to vote after the Voting Rights Act was passed. So we had very small numbers of Black people being able to register and actually vote. And then after the passage of this, we have a huge influx of possible voters going out and voting for the first time. So this is really kind of the promises of the Reconstruction era of the United States really being solved almost 100 years, almost exactly 100 years after the end of the Civil War. So many of the ideas from that time of actually providing voting rights and equality and legal rights to Black people actually took 100 years to become law, which is crazy to think about. Also, during this time, we had the 24th Amendment, which outlawed the poll tax, so you never had to pay to vote. So it got around that. And that's the end of all I have to say about the Civil Rights Act. I have a question for you guys, and the question is, what do you think is the most enduring legacy of the Civil Rights Movement? It went on for longer than this, and a lot of it becomes kind of intertwined with many of the different protest movements during this time, especially once the Vietnam War really gets going. And I just wanted to ask you guys about the 1960s in general. What's the most lasting contribution to what we see today from this time period? And I want you guys to really think about this. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you, U.S. History. I will see you some other time. Thank you very much for listening.